This is all of our cooling processes.
There's the buzzing noise.
Yeah, so it's a compressor that's in there that's running. It's basically just making a cold refrigerant fluid, and that's to cool down anything that's glycol jacketed. So other vessels are jacketed and have the ability to have the refrigerant go into them rather than the steam. And then I got a couple like bulk CO2 tanks right here that we use to get pressurized CO2. And then this right here, which is next to the boiler, this little tan guy, this is an air compressor. So that's how we get compressed air. Just for being able to move different stuff, different things around. Brian? This is Brian, he's one of our brewers here.
Hello.
I think I caught your names.
I'm Nate. This is Brian.
Nate and
Ryan.
Ryan?
Might I ask, what is the compressor for?
So it just makes pressurized air. So you have the ability, what do you usually use it for? Use it for cleaning and stuff?
No, to run the canning line.
Oh,
Mostly, yeah. And the keg washer. Both
Okay.
of those run off of compressed air.
Yeah, for their pumps. Oh yeah, for like the pneumatic.
It's very old.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. That makes sense.
That's probably from the original building.
It's very interesting. You've seen older ones?
Yeah, I've seen ones where you still shove a coal in the motherfucker.
So we'll keep talking about drain a little bit. You just leave that door open. So you probably saw at the bottom there was PVC coming out of the bottom of the silo out there. So we use what's called an auger. It's shaped like a screw, and it just turns and it moves the grain in the tube for us. So we'll auger it through this tube that's coming right in the building right there, and it'll go right into this room, into our mill room, where we actually mill the grain. So this has a counterbalance on it, so we can know how much weight we're using. It's a little dusty in here because there's a lot of dust created when you mill things. So basically what it does is it drops down through here, it grinds it all up, and then it hits this other auger, and we auger it back out of this room once we hit it with, get it all mashed up, crushed up basically. And then we can open this to put all of our specialty grains in. So we get our base malt from the silo, and then we can get all of our specialty grains from the bags we have right over here on the shelf.
Mulch.
So these are all our specialty malts. So this is how you get all the different colors, flavors that are attributed to the beer and malt character. So once we're done milling, we'll go into our holding vessel here. This is just to hold all of our milled grain before we start brewing. And then we'll auger it again right into our brew house over here. So this is where brew day happens. So there's brew day, which is where you're basically making a sugary substance that's called wort. Wort is just unfermented beer. And then there's fermentation. So all these vessels here are for fermentation. These two vessels and these three vessels here are all for brewing. So we use those for all of our brewing processes. This one holds hot water, and this one holds cold water. So we have the ability to heat things up, cool things down with water specifically, rather than just steam for certain things. So that one's steam jacketed, and this one's glycol jacketed. So that's how we can control temperatures. You guys can come on up here, and I'll show you the brew house. Kind of talk about the process. So the first place we go is here with our grain, okay? So we add hot water and grain to this. The hot water is around 160 degrees when we're adding it, and then we steep the grain about 152 to 155 degrees, somewhere in that range. And basically what we're doing in that process is turning those starches that the maltsters created for us into sugars that our yeast will later turn into alcohol when it's fermenting. So right here, that'll get all dropped in here at the same time, the water and the grain together. And you can see down there that there are some paddles. So those paddles will mix everything up, kind of like what you would need like in a, you're like creating a nice oatmeal, essentially. And just making sure that all of it gets thoroughly soaked up in the water. You don't want any dry stuff, like a clump of dry stuff. It just makes it so we're more efficient. So then we pump the liquid with the malt into this vessel. This vessel has a false bottom on it that you can see. It's just basically like a cauldron or like a strainer. So from there, we'll start moving the liquid between this vessel and that vessel, but the grain will only stay in this vessel. We'll end up with just grain in here because the false bottom doesn't let it leave. And as we move the liquid over into there, we'll rinse it, we'll bring it back over, pump it on top of this, and we'll start compressing our grain bed. And it's a good way just to squeeze out all of those sugars and be as efficient as possible. What's up?
What do you do with the grain after it's done in
So
here?
you can come on down here and I'll show you. So we take a forklift and we get a big container. Put that container under this. And Brian can tell you about this because he does this on Brew Day. We will take a shovel or squeegee, and this guy will kind of help us a little bit. You can see that. That'll start spinning so it can push all of it towards the door for us.
It does most of the work.
It does most of the work, yeah. But then we're just kind of moving it out and putting it into a big container that we send to a farm, and they use it as feed for cattle.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it, so they'll mix it in with like other grain that hasn't been used. It's called spent grain because it's already been used, most of the nutrients have already been taken out of it during the brewing process or steeping it.
Is it safe for the cows to eat?
Yeah, it's just kind of like a little sugary because there's some residual sugars that are still like in it. It's still kind of sticky and sugary. They actually love it because it tastes good.
Yeah.
So like my last place I used to work at, my boss told me that the cows got to know the sound of his truck because they knew that was when they were getting spent grain and they're happy.
Like, yay, it's treat day.
So the last
I didn't even know
vessel
that.
is called, well, sorry. When we're done with the grain, we'll move just the liquid back over into that first vessel we were in, and that becomes our boiler. So that's steam jacketed, so we can bring it up to a complete boil. When we're boiling, we start adding hops. So another interesting kind of historical thing about making beer is the invention of the IPA, the Indian Pale Ale. India Pale Ale. The story of the invention of the IPA dates back to when England colonized India, and they wanted to have beer in India. So they needed to create a beer that would last for a long period of time without refrigeration, because back then they didn't have refrigeration. So the best way to do that was to increase the alcohol content, because it's more preserved when it has more alcohol content, and then two, add more hops. Because hops have an antioxidant characteristic and antibacterial characteristic to them that come from these things called alpha and beta acids. So they are what's called isomerized during the boil, which basically just means that they get extracted from the hops during the boil. And the longer you boil the hops, the more you'll get out of it, the more efficient you'll be. So a boil will be typically about an hour long. It can be shorter or longer, but the typical boil is about an hour. And during that time, you're adding hops and sterilizing your unfermented beer, because you don't want to have any other bacteria in there than your yeast. You want your yeast to be the only thing that has a chance to eat those sugars. As soon as you cool down your wort to colder temperatures, once you get below like 180 degrees, all the bacteria wants to start eating it. So we don't let it get below 180 until we completely crash it to the temperatures that the yeast like, which is about like 70 degrees for an ale, or low mid 50s for a lager. So the last vessel that we'll go into is our whirlpool. So after we do our boil and we add our hops, we'll pump the unfermented beer into our whirlpool, which if you look down in there, it has a slotted hole. You're welcome to go up there and like shine a flashlight into there. You can see on the side there's a slotted hole at an angle, and basically when we're pumping it into there, it makes it so it creates a whirlpool and it gets going in a circle. That just helps us with our efficiency. It makes it so that any grain that made it through the false bottom, or any hops that we added during the boil that made it over into the whirlpool, get moved to the center of the vessel. And so later when we pull off the side of the vessel, we're leaving all of that stuff that we don't want behind in here and not putting it into our fermenters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I look?
Yep, go right ahead.
I'm gonna need to borrow your flashlight.
So it's going to be on the left side. You'll see it. It's actually not that very large of a hole, but it's over there on the left side near the bottom.
Right there, see?
That tiny one over there? Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah, basically like a centrifuge, yeah. So that's the last vessel we'll be in for the brew house. The last thing we do during brew day is we cold crash our beer and we oxygenate it, moving it over into the fermenter all at the same time. So this is a heat exchanger. So we will have cold water come in this side right here. We'll send hot wort. I believe it's in this one. I'm not really sure. It's in this one.
No, it's all in the bottom. So it
The
comes
hot wort's on this side.
Yeah, it comes out one of these 3 draws through the pump and then comes in there.
Yeah. So we'll come in here with the hot wort on this side. Cold water will come in, and then hot water will exit one of these. I'm not sure which one. But then we have cold wort coming out right here. And so we can have this temperature probe in line to see what temperature our wort is at when we're sending it to the fermenter. And then right here we'll hook up oxygen. Oxygen is really healthy for yeast. It helps them build cell walls when they're reproducing. The first thing they'll do before they start turning sugar into alcohol is they'll start reproducing and making more of themselves using the sugar and oxygen. So that oxygen really helps them in the early stages, and it just helps you have a healthy culture and makes a clean fermented beer. So once we're done at this, it's getting pumped straight into one of these vessels over here. They have what's called like a conical shape to them. These are our fermenters. That's where they will stay for an ale for approximately 2 weeks, and for a lager up to 4 or 5 weeks. When you're fermenting an ale, it's at a little bit more of a higher temperature, so it ferments a little bit faster, kind of intuitively. It also is what's called a top fermenting yeast, where the yeast will sit on top of the fermenting beer while it's doing its thing, whereas lager yeast is a bottom fermenting yeast. So it will ferment at a colder temperature, it ferments a little bit slower, and it also gives different characteristics and ferments at the bottom of the vessel. Those are the 2 main types of yeast that are used in brewing, but there are a large variety of different types of ale yeasts and varieties of different types of lager yeasts that are used to make different styles of beer, all having their own set of characteristics that they attribute to the beer.
May
There's
I
probably over like 100 different types that are commercially used.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
How often do you guys do brew day?
So brew day is like a 8-hour work day, basically. So whoever's
wow.
brewing for the day, that's what they do for the day. Because there's a lot of cleaning involved. You got to also do the whole process of brewing it, and then also you have to clean up again. And we have to make sure everything's sterilized. There's a lot of really important factors when it comes to cleaning and sterilization when you're making it. Because again, you don't want any bacteria touching anything once it's cooled down. You don't want to have any chance to grow, because you don't want it to outpace your yeast. If it outpaces your yeast and becomes the dominant culture, then you don't have beer.
Yeah. You get something else.
Yeah, you get something funky. So the last vessels that we use are our bright tanks. Before we go into our packaging, we transfer our beer, once it's done fermenting, over into our bright tanks. So the last thing we do in the fermenter is cold crash it. So it just makes it so that any particulate matter can kind of settle out a solution. And then we have a racking arm that goes above where all that particulate matter is. So it's just pulling clean beer and putting it into the bright tank. Once it's in the bright tank, we will use a carbonation stone to carbonate our beer. So this is a carbonation stone. It has a bunch of really, really tiny holes right here. And these really, really tiny holes have small, small bubbles of CO2 that come out of them when we hook up a tank to this. And that just quickly carbonates our beer. It takes like what, 5 hours, 4 hours?
No, not that long.
Not even?
Probably an hour and a half to 2 hours to carbonate one of these tanks up.
So come on around here. I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of the modern processes versus the older processes for carbonating beer. I think I still have something fermenting over here. Yeah, so I still got something fermenting right now. So this is a beer. You can see right here, it's making, there's a bunch of bubbles coming out of that. So it's bubbling up right now. So what it's doing is once the yeast starts to eat the sugars and make alcohol, it also creates carbon dioxide. So when it's creating that carbon dioxide, that pressure needs to be released. So we have a hole at the top of the tank that's hooked up to this piping, and we bring it down into a bucket of sanitizer just to make a one-way for the pressure to go. Nothing can get in.
What is all this stuff around the end?
That's just what's called like trub. It's just from the yeast, and it's just got super active, so it actually foamed all the way up to that hole up there, and then it came down the tube with the CO2. It just was just a little full. Because again, it's being made with an ale yeast, so the ale yeast is on top. So that it's called a krausen, but it also like has like trub in there, and it just ends up getting pushed up the tube a little bit when it's really active.
Yeah.
But in the modern, the way they used to carbonate beer, the modern day now, we use a pressurized CO2 tank with a carbonation stone with our bright tanks to carbonate. But the way that they used to carbonate beer was they would just shut the valve that's allowing the pressure to release, so it would start pressurizing itself. The CO2 that's being made by the fermentation process would start fermenting it naturally. It's called natural carbonation versus what we do in the production era now. It's called forced carbonation, where you're forcing the CO2 into solution. So that's kind of the end of the actual brewing and fermenting process. The last thing you're doing after you're carbonating your beer is you're putting it into a packaged vessel. So we have cans, like you can see right here, these are all empty cans. And then we also have kegs. So then you can see right there, that's an empty keg also. That's a smaller keg. We also have the larger kegs like that one over there. So those are all the vessels we will fill with our beer once it's done.
How many do you fill a day? Or like after the end of the process, how much do you get?
Our brew house is 20 barrels, so there's 31 gallons in a barrel, so approximately 600 change gallons are made in one batch. But these larger fermenters over here are 40 barrels, so we'll brew the same beer twice. These ones are our smaller fermenters. These ones are 20, so we'll just brew the beer once. And then these obviously are 40 barrel bright tanks. And so one of these, this is a half barrel keg. So if we just filled half barrel kegs, we'd get what? Approximately 80 kegs, yeah. So the last kind of cool machinery that we have here is our canning line. For the canning line, you can see our cans are on pallets. So we'll bring the pallets over here, we'll put this blue guy under them, and we can start cranking it up to bring it up to the level we need the first level of cans to be at. And we'll start depalletizing them and bringing it onto our canning line. So it's got a little conveyor belt to move them all forward. And then it hits our twist rinse where we'll date it. So this right here has got a little, I don't know, what is this called? It's a printer of some sort.
Ink sprayer.
Ink sprayer, yeah. But it just sprays on a date onto the bottom of the can for us. And then the cans will twist and get rinsed with water. At this point, it's really, really important to decrease the amount of what's called breakout, which is the amount of CO2 coming out of solution of the beer when you're filling the cans. By adding cold water to the cans, you cool the can. Colder temperatures help carbon dioxide stay in solution. And it also, just by having liquid on the side of the can, helps it from coming out of solution. It'll come down here to this next conveyor belt and where we actually start filling. So these guys go up and down as we're filling. We will purge 4 of them with CO2. Another really important thing once you make finished beer, although we liked having oxygen for the yeast when we started fermentation, once we have finished beer, oxygen is the enemy. It will oxidize your beer, and that is a way that beer can go bad. So we purge it with CO2. CO2 is heavier than oxygen, so it'll actually keep a protective layer in the can as you're filling it from the bottom with the beer. So we'll purge 4 at the same time we'll be filling 4, and then we'll just keep going down the conveyor line. Then we'll hit where our tops drop on top of the can. So the cans originally are empty and don't have a top on them at all. And then once we purge them, fill them, we'll drop a top on them like that, and it'll get sent over to our can seamer with the beer in there. The pneumatic arm will push the can into where the seamer seams. There's basically 2 discs in a seamer that come in, and they pinch this side when it comes in rotating, while this is also spinning. It comes in, it'll pinch that, and then another one on the other side with a different diameter will do the second pinch, and then it'll be seamed. So that'll make it so that we have a seamed can that can't be, doesn't have any cracks or anything, and it's super, super sealed. You can handle the pressure. Last thing is just a little rinse on the outside of the can if there's any beer that came outside the can, just to make it not sticky when we're packing it out. And then we weigh our cans to make sure that they're the correct weight. If they're not the correct weight, we can't sell them because they don't have enough beer in them. They could potentially have oxygen in the can, and also we're just not selling them a full can of beer, so we can't do that. So as we weigh them, we'll pack them out, and then that's the whole process of canning.
Is this one hard to clean? It looks fairly clean, but it looks impossible to clean.
Brian will answer that.
Yeah, it is a little bit hard to clean. We have to hose it down every time we use it, and then we run chemical loops through it as well to break up anything that the sticky beer has left behind. So.
And you can't use all chemicals on this because of the plastics. You can only use less harsh chemicals.
Or hot water. Yeah, we can't use hot water on it either, so it is a little bit annoying to clean compared to most things.
All the little tiny crevices.
Yeah, but this machine was super important for us as a company because when the pandemic happened, all of the restaurants stopped buying beer. So that means we weren't selling as much kegs of beer. But luckily, we had just gotten this machine, and so we were ready to make more cans. And we were lucky enough to get into a bunch of grocery stores. And so we never stopped making as much beer as we were making. Our margins just went down a little bit because we were selling packed in cans, which just isn't quite as good of margins as kegs are. But we were still, operational, making just as much beer as we were making before the pandemic. And now that we're kind of through it a little bit more and restaurants are coming back, our cans are staying pretty steady and our keg sales are just increasing.
Picking back up. Yeah, sounds great.
It's been great for our company. This
Oh
has really
my
helped
god,
us out.
all the cans over there.
Yeah, we
There's
have
a lot of them.
thousands and thousands of empty cans. So there's right now.
Warehouse right there. Yeah. We had, I want to say, 1,000 pounds of White Claw cans.
1,000 pallets of White Claw cans. Woof. That's a lot. Yeah.
It's like 5 by 200 row. They're double stacked.
Yep.
1,000 pallets.
That's a lot of pallets.
It's a lot of pallets.
What are the
5,000 square feet of our warehouse.
what are the yellow things for?
Those are wastewater tanks. So we use a lot of water in all of our processes. So there's only certain times we're supposed to be dumping water. So we have to put water into those vessels to hold them when we're not supposed to be dumping water.
Toxic chemicals or something. There's only certain times we're allowed to dump those. So we store it till we're allowed to dump it.
Can you reuse any of the water?
I mean, it goes to the city to be reused.
Yeah, so the city will recycle it. They'll send it through all their treatment plants
Yeah.
and
No.
no. But yeah, that's kind of our little facility here.
This is awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. So another little note on packaging for old styles. Another way that you can carbonate a beer without having the modern processes is by bottling and adding what's called priming sugar to it. So when you add the priming sugar, that will allow the residual yeast that is still in the beer to turn those sugars into carbonation and naturally carbonate in a bottle. You have to be very careful though when you're adding sugar and naturally carbonating, because if you add too much sugar, you can explode the bottle.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Are the ones you guys have here, what would you recommend? Beer?
What kind of beer do you like? Yeah.
I typically drink
Oh, Bird City Lager then.
Yeah, Bird City Lager or Arizona Gold.
Yeah, and if you like sweet stuff, we have the Sonoran White Chocolate, and we